So, as most of you know, I went to seminary at Starr King School for the Ministry in Berkeley, California. In many ways, applying to seminary is very much like applying to any other graduate program. You have to submit applications, transcripts, letters of recommendation, all the usual paperwork. And like other types of graduate studies, it requires a personal interview. To be honest, I don't really remember much about the interview itself. I was way too nervous. Even at my advanced age, it was a kind of freaky experience. But I do remember two questions that the interviewer asked me that I thought were profound. "What makes you angry?" she asked. And then later, "What breaks your heart?" Now, honestly, I felt a little bit blindsided by those questions. I had been through enough interviews that I knew, the standard questions, what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses and all of that business. But those two questions, what makes you angry and what breaks your heart, those were not questions that I had any experience in answering. On reflection, though, it seems to me that these are absolutely brilliant interview questions that perhaps every interviewer should ask. They invite a far deeper conversation than talking about strengths and weaknesses. In this context, the interviewer was asking me to look not only at what I could do, but at who I was, who I am, and what I was called to do in the world. Now, I'm not a fool. Well, some people would dispute that. And I do try to not be most of the time, and I'm aware that the answers to those questions, what makes you angry, particularly, they can just as easily be used as a source of pain and horror in the world. One of my mentors, the Reverend Rebecca Ann Parker, writes, "Your gifts, whatever you discover them to be, can be used to bless or curse the world. You must decide." All too often when someone chooses to end another's life, it's because they made me angry. And I'm also not talking about simply being annoyed. When someone cuts you off in traffic, yeah, you might be pretty angry, but the reality is that you're just annoyed. What I'm talking about is that anger that goes to the bone, that moral outrage that comes when an innocent is being brutalized, when whole classes of people are being marginalized, when our sense of justice is so badly offended that we find we must do something. That's the kind of anger I'm referring to. It is the heartbreak of seeing needless suffering when we could be doing something about it. Even some small thing. It's seeing a child go hungry when we have so much. It's seeing someone in pain, knowing that simply sitting quietly with that person will mean so much. So, what breaks your heart? What makes you angry? For me, this is the basis of ministry. All too often we think of these words only applying to professional clergy. And if we should happen to think of them outside of a religious context, we think of them as special people who really, really are involved in their particular profession. But friends, I think that's too narrow a definition. I think that the late Reverend Gordon McKeeman, Unitarian minister, writes, "Ministry is all that we do together. Ministry is that quality of being in community that affirms human dignity. Miracles of birth and life, wonders of devotion and sacrifice. Ministry is what we do together with one another in terror and torment, in grief, in misery and pain, enabling us in the presence of death to say yes to life. We who minister speak and live the best we know with full knowledge that it is never quite enough. And yet we are reassured by lostness found, fragments reunited, wounds healed, and joys shared. Ministry is what we do together." That is, of course, reflected in our second reading this morning. Every person has a calling from God, who calls each of us by name. The heart of vocation is to be the unique person God calls you to be. We respond best to God's call when we let God serve others through us. This is ministry. Certainly, that last quotation is couched in traditional Christian language. But the message is the same. Ministry is what we do together when we allow the Holy Spirit, God, the human spirit, call it what you will, when we allow that to beckon us, to invite us to enter into a deeper, more constant, more reverent relationship. And quite frankly, to carry forward the hope and liberation which is at the heart of Unitarian Universalism. This Christian idea of ministry runs deeply through our Unitarian Universalist roots. Our forebears were, after all, Christians. They were liberal Christians, but they were Christians nonetheless. And they, as many Christians before them, staunchly believed in this idea of the priesthood of all believers. It means that ministry is not and should not be solely the realm of professional clergy. They believed that all people had a responsibility to discover the work God called them to do. Now, they based this concept on several passages from the Christian Bible, but the one I wanted to highlight this morning is what's known as the miracle of feeding the 5,000. Some of us heathens know it better as the miracle of the loaves and the fishes. Here's a little factoid. This is the only miracle that is present in all four of the canonical Gospels. Clearly, this particular story held great importance for those early writers. So in the story, Jesus is with his disciples and he's teaching this group of people. And Jesus says to his disciples, "Let's go get some rest." So they all get into a boat and start to leave. But people arrive from all over the area to see and hear Jesus, swelling this crowd to 5,000 people, and he starts talking to them. The disciples, though, say, "It's late in the day, send these people away so they can go get something to eat." Jesus says to his disciples, "You give them something to eat." And they say, "We don't have the money for that." And Jesus says, "So how many loaves do you have?" go and see how many you have. And they go and they come back and they say, we've got 5 loaves and 2 fishes. So Jesus blesses the bread and the fish, and he tells his disciples to distribute the bread and the fish. And we all know that everybody ate and were full, and then there was some food left over. That's a terrific story, I believe, that speaks of generosity and faith. And so there are a couple of things I want to point out. The first is the question of money. Clearly, the disciples were as worried about money, about paying the bills, as some of the folks here in this congregation. And Jesus could have said, you know what, you're right. They probably have more money than we do. Folks, go on home, come back tomorrow, and we'll talk. That might have been the logical thing to do. But he didn't. And maybe he was motivated by this feeling to be thrifty. Maybe his motivation was to save the disciples from having to spend all that money on fish and bread. I don't know what the motivation was. But none of that happened. Instead, he said to the disciples, just feed the people. It was at once both as complicated and as simple as that. He asked them to make a leap of faith, just as we are so often asked to do. But I also wanted to look at this story in terms of ministry. Not just my ministry, but your ministry. Now, Patrick O'Loughlin is an Assemblies of God pastor and missionary. I don't know if you know anything about the Assemblies of God, but they take their Bible very seriously. And Reverend O'Loughlin has written extensively about this particular miracle story and how it relates to ministry. He points out that while Jesus was certainly preaching, he wasn't actually doing the ministry. He says that those are 2 different things. It was the disciples who were called to do the work, to serve the people, to take care of the sick and such. O'Loughlin makes it very clear that preaching and ministry are 2 complementary but different things. When I'm standing up here talking to you, like I'm doing now, I may be trying to connect with you, to influence you, to challenge you, or to comfort you, or whatever I find myself doing on Sunday mornings up here. But in truth, according to this model, I'm not actually ministering to you. So let's look at what O'Loughlin says that ministry is. He says, first, it is work. The disciples were asked to do something. Feed them, Jesus says. I can only imagine how much work the disciples expected this was going to be. There were 5,000 people and 12 of them. Who was going to do all this work? They've been working hard. They're tired. They have lives. They have families. They have other obligations. They've got a bunch of stuff on their plate, for crying out loud. Yet O'Loughlin points out that O'Loughlin points out that when we minister, we must actively and consciously engage. It is an act, not a concept or an intellectual exercise. He also says that ministry is everywhere. We tend to think that ministry is something done under special circumstances, but the reality is that opportunities to ministry come at us all the time. A friend is having a bad day. A child gets hurt. A coworker is upset. These are all opportunities for ministry. My cousin, who incidentally happens to be Assemblies of God, she has a cake ministry. So let me tell you about her cake ministry. She makes this dynamite poppy seed cake. I have the recipe. And she makes them and gives them away for almost any occasion. When we were visiting Houston and we were getting ready to leave, she presented us with one of these poppy seed cakes as a blessing for our journey. Being a cashier at Walmart has often provided opportunities for ministry. So the final point of O'Loughlin's that I want to mention this morning is, he says it must be heartfelt. This is in fact where those questions about what makes you angry and what breaks your heart come in. In order for us to be motivated enough to do something, to put away our mundane, everyday troubles, it has to be personal, it has to be important. Certainly we can give money to worthy causes. We all do that, and it's important that we do so. Each week we are asked to contribute here at UUFS. And we are often bombarded by requests for money through the mail, through the internet, through social media, all sorts of places. And granted, it can be pretty overwhelming. And while this money may support someone doing ministry, we should not be fooled into thinking that this is actually doing ministry. No, my friends. Doing ministry requires that you do it, that you get your hands dirty, that you're engaged, that you're involved. If we are to truly minister to one another, it must be personal and it must be conscious. Our congregation offers some opportunities for ministry. Even in your order of service, you will see it's called Announcements and Opportunities for Personal Ministry. That's not just a title change. That should be a shift in focus from what can, and that focus should be coming from what can this congregation do for me to what can I do to make this world a better place? What makes you angry? What breaks your heart? And on that basis, we must act. Whether those acts are large or small, whether you're feeding 5,000 people or one, if we're to truly live our Unitarian Universalist principles, if we are to have a world of justice, equity, and compassion, if we are to work for peace, liberty, and justice for all, we must find our ministry. And why should you bother, you might well ask. Honestly, that's a really good question. We're all really busy people. There's a whole lot of stuff that we have to do. We have lives, family obligations, jobs. We're pulled in a million different directions. And maybe it's better that we just not bother. Take what you can get, grab all the gusto you can get, let it all go. There are a lot of people like that. We hear about the consumer mentality all the time. But my feeling is that you are here because you don't want to be one of those people. Wouldn't you rather feel like you're making at least some small contribution to make the world a better place? Don't you want to live with passion? Doesn't that seem like a better, more zesty, more juicier way to live? Because that's really what I'm talking about. Living life passionately. Anger and heartbreak open ourselves up to being more fully human. They are passionate concepts. And finding the answer to these questions will lead you to a more passionate, more compassionate life. So find a ministry and do it. Find a passion. Find out what makes you angry. Find out what breaks your heart. And then come back and inspire us by what you've done, like so many of you already do. Amen? Amen.